Well, today, beloved, we have a story of Jesus eating with the Pharisees. And this is a fairly common thing that Jesus does. He spends a lot of time hanging out with the Pharisees, and part of that is because the Pharisees are the religious leadership that are actually out in the villages. But they're also the ones that are probably the closest to Jesus' teaching. Some of the Pharisees are more in accord with Jesus' teaching, some are more opposed. But in many cases, the conflict between Jesus and the Pharisees is kind of an inter-family squabble. It's people who interpret things very similarly, but just off enough that it gets them into trouble with each other. And I often wonder why the Pharisees keep inviting him to dinner, because he's really a pretty rude host, or a pretty rude guest when it comes down to us. He's not a good dinner guest. In the passage just before this, he heals somebody who has dropsy on the Sabbath day at a dinner, which causes that whole question we had last week of healing on the Sabbath. So he gets into another one with them over that. And then today he tells people they should think of themselves lower than they are so that they might be found higher. You have to remember that a dinner at this in this culture is a very formal thing, that everybody has a particular place depending on your place of honor. There are accounts in Roman meals actually of different wines being served to different guests to show their status. It was a meal wasn't just a meal, it was a point where everybody sorted out their social place and found out where they sat with the host. So it's a very formalized affair. And he gives this description of how you should sit lower than you think you ought to so you get raised. And there's all sorts of sermons that can be taken off of that. But I'm going to focus on the second part of that parable, where Jesus kind of insults the host. He says to the one who invites him, when you give a luncheon or dinner, don't invite your friends or your brothers or your relatives or your rich neighbors, in case they might invite you in return and you get repaid. But when you give a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, and the blind, and you will be blessed because they cannot repay you, and you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous. Invite the poor, the crippled and lame, and the blind. Those groups have an additional meaning in Jewish religion of the time. In Jesus' time, those are the people that can't serve as priests in the temple. If you're a Levite, a member of the priestly class, and you're crippled, lame, or blind, you can't serve. So it's more than just people who have these conditions. These are people who society considers as outcasts. You have to remember that at the time, this kind of condition, whether poorness, actually, poverty, or being crippled or lame or being blind, was considered to be a punishment from God. We heard in that first reading from the Ecclesiasticus, the idea that sin has effects. Well, sometimes sin leads to effects, but you can't reason the other way, that if somebody has a problem, that it's caused due to their sin. But back then, they believed that, and some people still do. So these people are considered, either for their own faults or the fault of their parents. You talk about parenting guilt, This idea of, literally in this culture, if your child was born blind, everybody assumed you'd done something wrong. You were all automatically the worst parents in the world, just from birth right there, We don't generally think of that way anymore, at least not objectively. But we still have outcasts in our society, and we quite often think of them in the same way. We see them around downtown areas. We'll sometimes call them lazy or bums or moochers. And quite often you'll hear people articulate that they're there because they choose to be there. That if only they would be motivated, if only they would work harder, if only they would pick themselves up by their bootstraps, that they would no longer be in the condition that they're in. Of course, we call them the homeless. And this is generally what we think of when somebody says a homeless person. But this is actually what the face of homelessness is increasingly in America. It's increasing at an alarming rate. Families, women, and children. Here's a chart from the New York City shelter system showing the number of homeless children each night in the New York City shelter system, which is rising at a precipitous rate. Since 2007, there has been a 13% increase in family homelessness. As far as school-aged children, it surpassed 1 million for the first time during the 2011-2012 school year. That's a 57% increase over 2006. So this is a growing problem, especially among these populations that can't help themselves. And what causes those? Well, the largest trigger is loss of job. It's been the economy. The other part of it is the lack of affordable housing. As the recession has gone on, many of these affordable housing projects have failed and new ones haven't been put forth by the government. So there's no place to go after getting into the homeless shelter. After 30 days, you have to leave the homeless shelter. There's no affordable housing for people to get into for people who make minimum wage. So that causes an increasing problem among those populations. Here in Waukesha County, we have several groups that address this. We have the Salvation Army, which does an excellent job, shelters about 35 men a night. But we always have to remember that the Salvation Army is not a nonprofit. They're a religious organization, and they take only a specific population in. And then we have the Women's Shelter, who does a really excellent job with women who are victims of domestic violence. But once again, it's very specific. You have to be a woman or a woman with a family in a direct abuse situation where the abuse is actually occurring at the time. Which brings us back to Hebron House, which of course is my favorite nonprofit, mainly because I'm the president of the board. But we are literally the only people that take care of women and families who are homeless in Waukesha County. There aren't any other organizations that can provide that direct housing. And I got thinking about Hebron House for this sermon, because of that line from Hebrews, do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers, for by doing that some have entertained angels without knowing it. That's one of those lines that Bernie Juno, who's the founder of Hebron House, uses all the time. It's in some of the literature from Hebron House, this idea that when we take care of the poor, we may be entertaining angels. We have our two main shelters. We have Hebron House, which is over here on East Avenue, Sienna House, which is out on Summit. And the client demographics right now are very, very difficult. The Hebron House shelter system provides almost 12,000 nights of shelter per year. And the average stay is about 29 days, which is pretty low, actually. But there's currently a waiting list of 58 families. So I want you to think about that. In Waukesha County, there are 58 families who are currently homeless. To be eligible, you have to be homeless. There are 58 that are homeless and can meet the requirements for getting into the shelter. So that means there are more homeless out there. That's just what we know about. That's just the tip of the iceberg. And looking at the client demographics, this is just last week's stats. You can see where these people come from. We often have this idea that, gosh, there are all these chronically homeless people out there that are just sitting around. No, that's 3% of the population. 53% are people who are victims of domestic violence and have moved out of the women's shelter situation, the women's shelter situation. Or we have 28% with mental health issues. That's because we have no inpatient mental health treatment in Waukesha County. That was closed down several years ago. Or 14% chronic substance abuse, because we have no inpatient chronic substance abuse treatment facility in Waukesha County, because that was closed down several years ago. Or even veterans, which are an increasing number of people in the homeless population this year. It's amazing how many people come and are trying to get their veterans benefits but can't get them fast enough. In addition, part of the squeeze has been that the government help for those shelters lessens every year. Every year, the government spends less and less on housing and on feeding. It's one of those things. I keep hearing this argument about SNAP, which is the food stamps program, which is the first line of defense against homelessness and poverty. People talk about the fact that the use of this program has doubled in the last 5 years. Well, that's because we're in the middle of a recession. It doesn't actually seem all that unusual that the government use of SNAP would change over that amount of time. We're having a harder and harder time convincing people, it seems, that taking care of the poor is something that we're supposed to do as a society. In fact, it's moving in the opposite direction to some extent. This is a clip from the New York Times. Columbia, South Carolina has made its way into the news. There are several other places in America that have been enacting these laws that basically make it illegal to be homeless. So if you're homeless, what happens is a downtown starts to revive from a business perspective. And then what happens is when a downtown starts to revive, you get more homeless. I try to explain this to people, is that's actually a sign that you're growing and you're doing well. Because homeless people are attracted to a place that have lots of people, lots of downtown services, where lots of things are going on. So Columbia is doing really well and growing. So they've decided that what they need to do next is to get their homeless off the streets, and the way they're going to do that is through legal means. You now have 3 options if you're a homeless person. You spend the day inside the shelter off the streets, or you go to jail, or you leave Columbia. They will drop you off at the city limits and let you figure out where you're supposed to go. This is one of the councilmen, I'm not going to name him. I actually wouldn't have used this picture except that it appears he's standing in a church, which I think is an interesting symbol. He says, if we don't take care of this big piece of our community and our society, it will erode the entire foundation of what we're trying to build in this city. What I see is a giant risk to business. Or a quote from their mayor, we've got to make sure that every single thing we do focuses on continuing to attract advancement. Nothing can be a distraction. And that's what the homeless have become for us as a society. They're a distraction. They're an interruption. They're something that make us stop and notice that not everything is right in the world. We like to put up a facade that everything is perfect and everything is right and everything is growing and everything is doing well. And the homeless are a reminder to us that that's not true. It's actually a good thing, if you ask me, because Jesus is all about interruptions. You know, if you watch how Jesus acts with his disciples are constantly mad at him because he's going to meet important people, and he keeps stopping for people that they think are beneath his notice over and over and over again, whether it's the Syrophoenician woman or the woman caught in adultery or the centurion servant or this. Time and time again, they all have to stop their grand parade because Jesus has found another needy person who needs to be taken care of. And that's just how Jesus works. Interruption and distraction force us to look at people in a new way, sometimes a way we would prefer not to. So what we need to be able to do, especially as the Christian voice in society, is say, yes, we see this, but we also see this. The crucified man on the park bench. We have to see the face of Jesus in the face of the needy. And a political caveat, God doesn't care how we do it. We can do it through direct outreach from the government. We can do it through tax breaks. We can do it through nonprofits. God doesn't care how we do it, but God wants us to do it and doesn't take our excuses for not being able to get ourselves organized correctly. God calls us to entertain angels. As a society, we're just not currently addressing that need. Jesus said, when you give a luncheon or a dinner, do not invite your friends or your brothers or your relatives or rich neighbors. Invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, and the blind, and you will be blessed because they cannot repay you, and you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous. Amen.